When an avoidant finally understands that their actions genuinely broke your heart, it usually does not happen in some dramatic movie-like moment. There is no sudden emotional breakdown, no perfectly timed confession, and no grand speech where they finally admit everything they did wrong. With an avoidant, awareness tends to arrive much more quietly. Sometimes it takes weeks or even months before the reality of what happened truly reaches them. It often starts with something incredibly small. They may come across an old photo of you while scrolling through their phone. A song may suddenly remind them of you. A memory they had buried can unexpectedly return. Maybe they remember a conversation, a laugh, a place you visited together, or some tiny detail about you they once overlooked. At first, they may not even understand why it affects them. Avoidant people often disconnect from difficult emotions while those emotions are actually happening. Instead of processing the pain of separation immediately, they push it down and keep moving. They stay busy, distract themselves, and convince themselves they are fine. So when you leave, they may not experience the loss in the same immediate way you do. For you, the pain may begin the moment the relationship changes. For them, it may begin when your absence becomes impossible to ignore. When the messages stop, when your name no longer appears on their screen, when there is no longer someone checking in, offering warmth, understanding them, or making emotional space for them. Eventually, the silence becomes louder than the connection ever was, and that is when the cracks can begin to appear. An avoidant's perception of intimacy can become distorted by their own defenses. Your closeness may feel overwhelming, your affection may feel like pressure, your need for consistency may feel like an expectation they cannot meet. Even genuine love can activate fears of losing freedom, being controlled, getting hurt, or becoming responsible for another person's emotions. So they pull away, they create distance, they become inconsistent, they avoid difficult conversations, they convince themselves that needing someone is dangerous. Sometimes they sabotage the very connection they secretly value because their fear becomes stronger than their ability to tolerate vulnerability. This is what makes avoidant behavior so painful. Someone can care about you and still behave in ways that make you feel completely unwanted. Their actions can look like rejection, even when the deeper issue is fear. That does not excuse the damage they cause, but it can explain how someone can destroy something they never actually wanted to lose. There is another part of this pattern that is especially painful. The avoidant may never have truly believed you would leave. They may have become comfortable with your patience. They may have assumed that after every period of distance, you would eventually return. Somewhere in their mind, they may have expected you to keep understanding them, even when their behavior became confusing or hurtful. They may have believed you would always give them another chance, that you would always be there, that the emotional door would remain open. And because your presence became predictable, they stopped recognizing how valuable it was. Not because you became less valuable, because your availability became familiar. They knew you cared. They knew you were willing to understand. They knew they could pull away and possibly come back later, so they never had to seriously face the possibility of losing you until you finally reached your limit. And when you step away, it may not happen through anger. You may not make a dramatic announcement or try to punish them. You may simply become tired. You realize that constantly chasing clarity from someone who cannot give it is costing you your peace, so you stop. And that quiet decision can affect an avoidant more deeply than an argument ever could. Because suddenly, the old pattern no longer works. They cannot assume that their distance will be followed by your return. They cannot keep telling themselves that everything is fine because you will still be available whenever they decide to reconnect. Now the consequences of their choices become real. They begin to understand that the person they assumed would remain might actually be gone. But before regret often comes something else. Relief. This is extremely important to understand because their initial calmness can be heartbreaking if you interpret it as proof that they never cared. After separation, an avoidant may actually feel lighter. They may seem completely unaffected. They might become more social, focus heavily on work, spend more time with friends, immerse themselves in hobbies, or fill every empty moment with activity. From the outside, it can look like they moved on instantly. But emotional relief does not necessarily mean emotional indifference. For someone with strong avoidant defenses, distance can initially calm their nervous system. When intimacy is no longer creating emotional pressure, they may feel as though they can finally breathe again. So they tell themselves they made the right decision. They focus on everything that was difficult. They convince themselves they are better off alone. They create a story that the relationship simply was not meant to work. And for a while, they may genuinely believe that story. They keep themselves busy because being busy prevents deeper reflection. Work becomes an escape. Friends become an escape. Entertainment, exercise, hobbies, social media, or constant activity can all help them avoid sitting alone with what they actually feel. Anything is easier than asking themselves, what did this person really mean to me? But avoidance has a weakness. Relief eventually fades. Once the distractions become less powerful and the emotional pressure has settled, the feelings they pushed away can begin returning. That is when memories start carrying a different weight. They remember your voice, your humor, the way you cared, the conversations they once took for granted, the small things about you that they never thought they would miss. And slowly, your absence begins to mean something different. They are no longer simply missing the relationship. They may be realizing that they pushed away someone who genuinely mattered to them. That realization can hurt because there is no longer a relationship in front of them to distract from the truth. There is only the empty space where you used to be. And that space can force them to confront something they avoided for a long time. Maybe you were never the problem. Maybe the closeness was not the enemy. Maybe the love was not too much. Maybe their fear was simply louder than their ability to receive what you were offering. And by the time they understand that, they may also realize something even more painful. Their defenses did not just protect them from getting hurt. Those same defenses may have cost them someone they never truly wanted to lose. That is when the heartbreak they caused can finally become real. Not because you chased them for an explanation, not because you tried to make them jealous, not because you forced them to regret what they did, but because your absence removes the emotional safety net that allowed them to avoid the consequences. Sometimes, silence becomes the mirror, and in that mirror, they can finally see what their avoidance had been hiding all along. And once that initial sense of relief disappears, reality can begin reaching them in ways they never expected. It rarely happens on their schedule. Instead, it catches them during ordinary moments when their defenses are down. They may walk into a restaurant, park, street, or familiar place where the two of you once spent time together, and suddenly the memory of you comes rushing back. They may hear something hilarious and have the immediate instinct to send it to you, only to remember that they no longer can. They might meet someone new and realize that the connection feels empty, even though everything seems perfectly fine on the surface. Or perhaps they experience a difficult day and instinctively long for the comfort you once gave them. They remember how easily you understood what they were feeling, sometimes without them even having to explain it. And that is when they begin to notice the difference between having people around them and actually feeling emotionally understood. This is where the deeper breaking can begin, not in some dramatic or visible way, but internally. They start looking backward. They remember the messages you sent when you were desperately trying to clear up misunderstandings. They remember the patience you showed when they became distant. They remember the times you waited for a response while having no idea what was happening inside their mind. They remember the moments when their silence left you confused, anxious, or hurt. And eventually, they may remember the tears, even the ones you never showed them. An avoidant may not process guilt at the exact moment they hurt someone. Instead, they can push that uncomfortable feeling down. They convince themselves that the situation was complicated, that they needed space, or that walking away was necessary. But emotions that are avoided do not simply disappear, they wait. And with enough time, that guilt can become heavier. It sits quietly in the background until they can no longer completely ignore it. Then comes one of the hardest realizations of all. They notice that you are healing. They see that you are no longer waiting for their message. They realize that you are no longer organizing your life around whether they return. They notice that the emotional energy you once invested in them is slowly being redirected toward yourself, and that can hit an avoidant much harder than your anger ever did. Because somewhere inside, they may have expected you to miss them forever. They may have assumed that even after pushing you away, your heart would remain emotionally attached to them. They may have believed that if they ever wanted to return, you would still be standing in the same place, ready to welcome them back. They may have mistaken your love for permanent availability. So when they finally see you moving forward, something changes. You are standing on your own. You are rebuilding your confidence. You are becoming emotionally stronger. You are finding happiness that no longer depends on their presence. And for the first time, they can see the situation from a different perspective. They begin to understand that their distance did not simply protect them from intimacy, it cost them intimacy. They were not protecting something valuable, they were pushing away something valuable. They were not keeping themselves safe from a relationship that was destroying them. They may have been destroying a relationship that was offering them warmth, patience, understanding, and emotional safety. And realizing that can be devastating, because now they have to confront the possibility that the person they lost was not asking for too much. You were simply asking for a connection that could not survive on your effort alone. Avoidant feelings can be very real, but their timing can be painfully delayed. They may feel things long after the moment when those emotions could have changed their behavior. They may understand your value after they have already created distance. They may recognize how much they cared only after the relationship has become a memory. That is why their emotional process can seem so confusing. One day, they appear completely detached. Later, they are thinking about everything. They may open old conversations and read them again. They may scroll through pictures they once barely noticed. They may replay specific moments and wonder how differently things could have gone if they had responded with honesty instead of shutting down. They remember your consistency. They remember how safe your presence sometimes felt. They remember how you could make them feel understood without demanding that they reveal everything at once. And they begin to recognize that the security they experienced around you meant much more than they ever admitted. There can be a painful realization hiding underneath all of this. They may finally tell themselves the truth they spent so long avoiding. I hurt someone who was genuinely trying to love me. That thought can carry enormous weight, especially at night, when the day becomes quiet, when the phone is no longer distracting them, when work is finished and friends are gone, when there is no longer anything external demanding their attention. That is when the thoughts they avoided during the day can become impossible to escape. They remember what they said, what they didn't say, the moments they pulled away, the chances they ignored, the affection they received but never properly acknowledged. And sometimes they begin to wonder whether they could have handled everything differently. This is often when an avoidant starts thinking about returning. But there is something important you need to understand. Avoidance can come back without being healed. A return does not automatically mean transformation. Missing you does not automatically mean they have learned how to love you differently. Regret does not automatically create emotional maturity. They can recognize your value and still struggle with the same fears that caused them to leave. They can miss your presence and still become overwhelmed when intimacy returns. They can feel guilty about hurting you and still not know how to communicate their emotions in a healthy way. So if they eventually reach out, do not measure their growth by the fact that they came back. Look at what they do after they come back. Are they more consistent? Are they willing to communicate? Can they tolerate emotional closeness without immediately creating distance? Can they acknowledge the hurt they caused without becoming defensive? Are they willing to take responsibility instead of simply saying they miss you? Because the most meaningful sign of change is not that an avoidant returns, it is that they return differently. And that difference cannot be proven through one emotional message, one late-night confession, or one sudden burst of affection. It has to appear through repeated actions. Real change is quiet too. It looks like staying when things become uncomfortable. It looks like communicating instead of disappearing. It looks like allowing vulnerability instead of running from it. And most importantly, it looks like understanding that your heart is not a place they can repeatedly leave and return to whenever their fear becomes manageable. If they truly realize what they lost, they will eventually have to understand that loving you means more than missing you. It means learning how not to lose you again. They often return because they miss the emotional safety you created around them. They remember how your presence gave them a place where they could feel accepted, understood, and protected from a world that sometimes felt too demanding. Your love became a kind of refuge, even if they never had the emotional awareness to acknowledge it while they had it. But when they come back, they may discover something they never expected. You are different now. You are no longer the same person who constantly gave more than they received. You are no longer endlessly explaining yourself, waiting for answers, making excuses for their distance, or trying to convince someone to recognize your value. You have changed. You have developed boundaries. You have learned to protect your peace. You have realized that loving someone should never require you to abandon yourself. And this transformation can be shocking to an avoidant because your strength forces them to look at themselves differently. They may finally recognize a truth they spent years running from. They were not impossible to love. They simply were not emotionally ready to receive the kind of love they were being offered. And by the time they understand that, they may realize they lost someone who was willing to stand beside them, even during the parts of themselves they struggled to accept. That realization can become a private form of grief. They may never tell their friends how deeply it affected them. They may never openly admit how much they regret their choices. They can continue appearing calm and composed, while privately replaying everything in their mind. They see things more clearly now, but the clarity arrives late. They understand the value of your love after losing access to it. They recognize their patterns after those patterns have already created consequences. They understand what they were afraid of only after their fear helped destroy something genuine. And that is one of the hardest lessons an avoidant can face. But there is something even more important for you to remember. Their breaking point is not yours to repair. Their regret is not something you are responsible for comforting. Their emotional awakening is not the closure you need in order to move forward. You do not have to wait for them to understand everything before giving yourself permission to heal. Your story does not end with the moment they finally realize what they lost. Your story continues with the person you became because you survived it. You did more than simply get through the pain. You changed because of it. You became stronger. You became wiser. You became more aware of what you will and will not accept. You learned that self-respect sometimes means walking away from someone you still love. You learned that choosing yourself does not mean you never cared about them. It means you finally understood that your own heart deserves care too. You walked away not because your feelings suddenly disappeared, but because you realized that continuing to abandon yourself for someone else was no longer love. It was self-neglect, and you were no longer willing to live that way. The avoidant's final realization may be painfully simple. Love was never the real danger. Vulnerability was never the enemy. The thing they truly lost was you. They did not simply lose a relationship or someone who happened to be there for a period of time. They lost a heart that continued showing up even when they struggled to show up themselves. They lost someone who tried to understand them when they could barely understand their own emotions. They lost someone who offered patience, warmth, and genuine connection while they were still fighting against their own defenses. But their realization does not determine where your life goes from here. You do. So hold your head high. Protect the boundaries you worked so hard to build. Keep moving forward, even when part of you still remembers what could have been. You do not need to become bitter to become strong. You do not need to stop caring in order to choose yourself. And you do not need their apology, regret, or return to prove that what you gave was meaningful. Your love was not wasted. The care you gave was real. The patience you showed came from a genuine heart. But sometimes you can offer something beautiful to someone who simply does not have the capacity to receive it at that moment. And that does not make your love less valuable. It means their readiness did not match your willingness. Your next chapter is not about whether they eventually come back. It is about who you become when you stop waiting for someone else to decide your worth. It is about choosing peace over confusion, consistency over emotional uncertainty, self-respect over endless waiting, and yourself over the version of love that required you to keep disappearing inside someone else's fears. That is the real transformation. You did not lose yourself in the end. You found yourself. And perhaps that is the most important thing this entire experience was trying to teach you. Thank you for watching. If this message connected with something you have experienced, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe to The Avoidant Guide for more insights into avoidant psychology, emotional healing, and relationships. And before you leave, share your story in the comments. Tell us what you learned, how your healing journey changed you, or what realization finally helped you choose yourself. Your experience may be exactly what someone else needs to read today, because sometimes your healing becomes someone else's reminder that they can choose themselves too.